Sun's already up out here, light coming through the trees. Last episode ended with a number, a scale reading that finally forced an honest look at where things actually stood. This chapter picks up right after that moment, and the honest look, it turns out, was only the opening move. The much harder part was what came next. Once that first painful truth led straight into a whole series of others, each one a little harder to face than the last. The chapter is called Truth Hurts, and the title isn't just about the discomfort of that first mirror moment. It's about what happens once you've actually opened that door and truths keep arriving, one after another, each one demanding to be looked at with the same honesty as the first. For Goggins, the truths kept stacking up fast. Once the decision to change had actually been made, the next discovery was almost mathematically brutal. The specific physical standard required to even qualify for the path he decided on, Navy SEAL training, and the enormous, very literal gap between that standard and where his body actually stood. A specific number of pounds, needing to disappear in a specific, narrow window of time, far tighter than anything resembling a safe or conventional plan would ever recommend. That's not a metaphorical hard truth. It's an actual number, sitting there, refusing to be softened, exactly like the number from the previous chapter, except this one came with a deadline attached. I want to spend this whole episode on what happens after the first honest look, because I think this chapter is really about a second, harder layer of truth-telling, the kind that goes past acknowledging where you currently stand and starts dismantling the specific stories you've been telling yourself about why you can't close the gap. Here's the distinction I think this chapter is actually drawing, and it's worth being precise about it, because it's easy to blur the two together. The last episode was about facing an external, factual truth, a number, a pattern, a situation, looked at honestly instead of through a softened lens. This chapter goes a layer deeper into the internal stories that get used to explain why that external situation is the way it is. Not just here's where I actually stand, but here's the specific lie I've been telling myself about why I'm stuck here, and it's time to test whether that lie is actually true. Almost everyone carries a small collection of these internal stories, rarely examined closely, because examining them closely is exactly the kind of thing that hurts. I'm just not built for this. I've always been like this. My body type doesn't allow for that. Some of these stories contain a grain of real truth. Most of them, once actually tested rather than simply accepted, turn out to be far less solid than they felt while they were quietly running the show. It's worth naming why these stories are so much harder to spot than the external fact from the last episode, since that difficulty is really the whole reason this chapter needed to exist separately. An external fact, a number on a scale, a training log, announces itself the moment it's actually looked at. An internal story doesn't announce itself the same way. It usually doesn't feel like a story at all. It feels like a fact indistinguishable from the genuinely true things it sits alongside, which is exactly what makes it so easy to carry for years without ever noticing it was a claim rather than a settled reality. I had my own version of this, distinct from the excuse list from the previous episode, and it's worth walking through honestly because I think the shape of it is common. For years, I carried a specific story about my own pace, that a body with this particular history of injuries at this particular age simply wasn't built to get meaningfully faster, that whatever speed I currently had was close to a hard ceiling rather than a starting point. I'd never actually tested that story directly. I just accepted it, the way you accept a fact rather than a hypothesis, because testing it honestly would have meant risking the discovery that the ceiling was lower than it needed to be, which would have made every slow month since then a little harder to explain away. The specific lie usually survives not because it's been proven, but because it's never actually been tested. Testing it honestly requires a specific kind of courage this chapter is really about. The willingness to find out you might have been wrong about yourself, which is a strange, uncomfortable kind of risk that doesn't get talked about nearly as much as the more obvious risks like injury or failure. I eventually tested mine, almost by accident rather than through some dramatic decision. A structured block of speed work, the kind I'd avoided for years because that's not really what my body responds to, produced a meaningfully faster pace within about 6 weeks. Not dramatically faster, but enough to make the old story impossible to keep believing without at least some real doubt attached to it now. The ceiling hadn't been physical. It had been untested, which is a completely different kind of limit, and finding that out stung in a specific, particular way this chapter's title captures well. It wasn't just discovering a limitation was smaller than believed. It was discovering how many years have been spent organizing decisions around a story that had never once been checked against reality. There's something worth naming about that particular sting, because it's different from the discomfort covered in the last episode. Facing an honest number, a scale reading, or a training log hurts because it confirms something uncomfortable. Testing an untested story and finding it false hurts differently, because it doesn't just reveal a problem. It reveals that the problem was partly self-manufactured, sustained by a choice never to look closely rather than by any actual evidence. That's a harder kind of truth to sit with, not because the fact itself is worse, but because it implicates the years spent not checking, not just the situation those years produced. It's worth adding one honest note here, because this particular truth can sting in a way that's easy to mishandle. The temptation, once a story like this gets disproven, is to swing hard into regret, replaying every year the untested belief was allowed to quietly run the show. That regret is understandable, but it isn't actually the point of this chapter, and dwelling in it too long just trades one kind of paralysis for another. The years spent not testing the story are gone regardless of how much time gets spent regretting them now. What's actually available, starting today, is simply more testing applied to whatever comes next, rather than an accounting of everything the old story already cost. There's a second layer to this chapter worth naming. The size of the actual gap once both kinds of truth, the external number and the internal lie, get faced honestly at the same time. Goggins' gap was almost absurd on paper, a physical transformation on a timeline that looked, by any reasonable outside assessment, essentially impossible. Facing a gap that large honestly creates a specific kind of danger this chapter has to address directly. The size of the gap itself can become paralyzing, a new kind of avoidance disguised as realism. It's entirely possible to face a hard truth honestly and then use the sheer scale of what it demands as a fresh excuse to do nothing, reasoning that if the gap is genuinely this large, no reasonable person could actually be expected to close it. I want to be precise about how sneaky that particular trap actually is, because it borrows the language of honesty to produce the exact opposite of what honesty was supposed to accomplish. Someone who's just faced a genuinely difficult truth feels, understandably, like they've already done the hard part, the uncomfortable looking, the confronting, concluding right after that the resulting gap is simply too large to close, feels like an extension of the same honesty rather than a betrayal of it. It isn't. It's a second, subtler kind of self-deception, one that hides behind the credibility earned by the first honest look, using that credibility to justify an action that the first honest look was never actually meant to produce. The way through that specific trap, and I think this is the real payoff of this whole chapter, isn't shrinking the gap to make it feel more comfortable. It's refusing to look at the entire distance at once, and instead asking only what the very next action available is, regardless of how enormous the total gap actually is. A gap of any size gets closed by exactly one mechanism. The next honest action, taken today, without needing the whole remaining distance to feel manageable first. Goggins' path toward that seemingly impossible number wasn't achieved by comprehending the entire transformation in one sitting and finding the courage to face all of it at once. It was closed one day, one meal, one workout at a time, each individual piece small enough to actually be done, regardless of how impossible the sum of all of them look from a distance. This connects to an idea covered a few episodes into the last book, prioritizing one problem instead of trying to solve everything simultaneously. Except here, it's applied to a single enormous goal rather than several competing ones. The size of the goal doesn't actually change what today's action needs to look like. A goal that requires 100 small actions and a goal that requires 5 both get worked on the exact same way. One action, today, regardless of how many more remain after it. The only thing that changes with a larger goal is how many mornings this same narrow question has to get asked again, not the size or shape of the question itself. That reframing alone. The size of the goal only changing the number of repetitions rather than the nature of any single day's task is probably the most practically useful sentence in this entire chapter. I want to walk through what this actually looks like as a practice, because both halves of this chapter, testing internal lies and facing an intimidating gap, need something concrete to translate into rather than staying as ideas. The first piece is identifying one specific internal story you've been carrying about your own limitations, the kind that survived mostly because it's never actually been tested. Not a vague sense of low confidence in general, a specific, nameable claim. I can't get faster because of my age. I can't build real strength because of an old injury. I've always been this way, and that's just who I am. Write the specific claim down precisely the same way last episode asked for a specific number rather than a vague feeling. The second piece is designing the smallest honest test of that specific claim, something concrete enough to actually produce evidence rather than more speculation. Not a permanent dramatic overhaul that proves the story wrong forever in one shot. A bounded, specific experiment for the 6 weeks, aimed directly at the claim, structured well enough that the result will actually mean something regardless of which way it comes out. If the claim turns out to be true, that's useful information too, a real constraint worth respecting rather than a story worth dismantling. The point isn't assuming every internal story is false. It's refusing to let any of them go untested simply because testing them is uncomfortable. I want to be specific about what makes a test like this actually count as honest, because it's easy to design one that quietly guarantees the comfortable answer without meaning to. A test that's too short, too gentle, or too easily explained away by unrelated factors isn't really testing the claim. It's just going through the motions of testing while leaving plenty of room to preserve the original story regardless of what happens. A real test needs a clear enough structure and a long enough window that the outcome, whichever way it lands, actually settles something rather than just adding another data point to argue about later. There's a specific way this can go wrong that's worth naming directly, because I nearly fell into it myself before catching it. An early attempt at testing that pay story lasted less than 2 weeks, produced no meaningful change, and I was already halfway toward concluding the original story had been confirmed. What actually happened, once I looked honestly, was that 2 weeks was never long enough for a real adaptation to show up, which meant the test hadn't actually tested anything. It had just given the old story a quick, painless reprieve. Extending the real test to 6 full weeks was what finally produced a result honest enough to actually mean something in either direction. There's a boundary worth being precise about here, because this chapter's whole spirit, confronting hard truths without flinching, can tip into something harmful if it's applied without care. Facing a difficult truth is not the same as manufacturing pain for its own sake, and testing a limiting belief is not the same as ignoring genuine physical signals that turn out to be real. The pace experiment that worked for me could just as easily have been a genuine injury risk if the underlying story had actually been protecting something real rather than something untested. The discipline here isn't reckless disregard for every limit. It's honest, deliberate testing of the specific limits that have never actually been examined, paired with real attention to what the test itself reveals, rather than a predetermined conclusion that every limitation is automatically false. This distinction matters enormously given who's likely listening to a channel built around an aging body with a real history of injuries. Some limits genuinely are physical, earned through real damage rather than untested assumption. And this chapter was never arguing that willpower alone dissolves every constraint a body actually has. What it's arguing is narrower and, I think, more honest. The specific limits worth respecting are the ones that have actually been tested and confirmed, not the ones simply inherited from an old, comfortable story that's never once been checked against what the body can actually do right now. There's a specific way to tell these two categories apart before starting any test worth naming clearly. A limit that's been confirmed through actual experience. A specific injury that specifically worsens under a specific kind of load deserves respect and careful accommodation, not a blunt test designed to override it. A limit that's simply been assumed, inherited from age, from a general sense of how bodies like this one are supposed to behave, from nothing more concrete than years of never checking, is exactly the kind of story this chapter is asking to be tested. The difference between those two categories is usually obvious once the question is actually asked directly. Is there real evidence behind this limit, or just years of never having looked? I want to address the second half of this chapter's practice too, the gap itself, because it deserves its own concrete version rather than staying abstract next to the internal story exercise. Once you've named a real gap, whatever version of it actually applies to your situation, resist the instinct to immediately calculate the entire distance and judge whether the whole thing feels achievable. That calculation, done honestly, will almost always produce a number large enough to feel discouraging. The same way Goggins' full transformation, looked at all at once, would have looked genuinely impossible to nearly anyone assessing it from the outside. Instead, ask only what the next single action is, small enough to actually complete today, with no requirement that it feel proportional to the size of the whole gap. Do that action. Tomorrow, ask the same narrow question again, fresh, without needing yesterday's action to have already closed some visible fraction of the total distance. The truth about the size of a real gap and the truth about what today's action should be are two separate questions, and conflating them is exactly what turns an honest, difficult truth into a paralyzing one. Facing the full size honestly matters, the same way facing the honest number mattered in the last episode. But facing it honestly was never supposed to mean staring at the whole distance every single morning before being allowed to move. It was supposed to mean acknowledging it once, clearly, and then getting back to the much smaller, much more answerable question of what today's single piece of progress actually looks like. I found it useful to actually separate these two questions physically, not just conceptually, keeping the honest, full-size accounting of a gap somewhere. It only gets revisited occasionally, monthly rather than daily, while the narrow, next action question gets asked fresh every single morning without reference to the larger number at all. Revisiting the full gap too often turns into exactly the kind of paralysis this chapter warns against. A daily reminder of how far there still is to go, which does nothing but make the next small action feel smaller and less worthwhile than it actually is. The full picture deserves honesty. It doesn't deserve daily attention. And knowing the difference between those two things is most of what actually keeps a gap this large workable over the many months it usually takes to close. Tomorrow morning, whatever specific story you've been carrying about your own limits, and whatever gap that story has been quietly protecting you from having to face honestly, is still going to be exactly as untested as it's always been. The truth doesn't get less true by staying uncomfortable and unexamined. It just stays sitting there, waiting the same way it was waiting this whole time, for someone to finally decide the discomfort of testing it was worth more than the comfort of continuing to believe it. There's a connection worth drawing between this chapter and where this whole channel started, a year and 12 episodes ago now. with a decision made in the dark before an alarm had even finished ringing. That first decision was really the smallest possible version of exactly what this chapter describes: a willingness to test a story. In that case, a story about whether getting up at all was even worth attempting, rather than simply accepting it as settled. Every episode since has really just been a longer, more detailed version of that same test, applied to a slightly different story each time. This one asks the same question again, aimed at whatever specific limit has been sitting untested the longest, waiting for someone to finally decide it was worth the discomfort of checking. I think that's ultimately what makes this second chapter feel like a natural continuation rather than a repeat of the first. Chapter 1 asked whether you were willing to see your actual situation clearly. This one asks something sharper. Once you can see it clearly, are you willing to question whether the story explaining it was ever actually true, or whether it was just the most comfortable available explanation, accepted because testing the alternative felt like too much to risk? Both questions point at the same underlying willingness. This one just asks it about the specific beliefs holding a person in place, rather than about the plain facts of where they currently stand. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, with one more honest truth on the table than there was yesterday. The forest doesn't care whether the truth is comfortable. It just waits quietly for whoever's willing to actually look at it. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.